Hanshan, Untitled. Pigs devour dead human flesh. Humans savor dead pig guts. Pigs don't mind, humans stink. Humans say pork smells fine. Throw dead pigs in the river. Bury human bodies deep. If they ever stop eating each other, lotuses will bloom in boiling soup. So we continue in our trend of investigating and including Buddhist poetry in these expansions of the 300 Tang poems. And today we come upon Hanshan, Cold Mountain, who is a rather unusual poet for a lot of reasons, even among the Buddhist poets. So let's start explaining this, the background of Hanshan. So as we say, Hanshan has traditionally been considered the name of a poet. There actually is no reliable information about his existence. There is a collection of 300 poems that are attributed to him. And there's the general belief that Hanshan was a Buddhist monk that lived probably in the early half of the Tang dynasty. As we say, the information about him is very sparse. Like the collection of poems that bears his name has a preface that gives some biographical information, but very sparse, which seems to point at Hanshan being a monk living in Zhejiang in the eastern coast of China during the perhaps during the early Tang dynasty. Stylistic analysis of the poems in this collection of Hanshan poems have shown that they're probably the work of different hands. Like there's a set of poems from the early Tang and a set of poems from the late Tang. So it's probably likely that Hanshan is more like a style. Maybe there was an original Hanshan who composed some Buddhist poems that were very characteristic in their subject matter and style and language. And they created a mini fad, you could say, for poems in the style of Hanshan. So probably later writers wrote poems in this style, and their poems were included under the heading and under the authorship of this mythical Hanshan, who would have been a Chan Buddhist monk. There is a biography of him included in Taoistic text, I think, or a Buddhist text, by Du Guanting in the Taiping Guangji. It says, "This master of Cold Mountain, no one knows his name. During the Dali era, which would have been the middle, after the Anlushan Rebellion in the 760s, he lived in reclusion in Mount Green Screen in Tiantai. This mountain runs so deep and high that in summer there was snow. It was also called Hanyang, or cold crag, cold cliff, and accordingly the monk gave himself the sobriquet Master of Cold Mountain. He was fond of writing poetry, and whenever he could come up with a verse or a line, he would immediately write it on a rock amidst the trees. Those men who were fond of such unusual things would immediately record them in all more than 300 poems. Most of them depicted the feelings of living in seclusion or criticized the political situation of the times, enabling him to awaken the common people." Okay, so as we say, Hanshan as a historical figure is more evanescent or more dubious than a lot of the scholar official poets that we've been reading poems of. But the poems are also really, really, really peculiar. As you've probably already noticed, even in the translation, the subject matter of these poems is very unusual. It's not your typical scholar official type of poetry. In fact, here you have an example of a poem that can be described probably as very direct, very grisly, very uncouth. It would have felt very inelegant for a scholar official to start a poem talking about pigs being eaten by men and men being eaten by pigs, and then their bodies being buried or thrown into a river. It's a very strongly Buddhist theme as well, like this idea of impermanence and the accumulation of bad karma and the possibility of transcending it in the last line, which we will comment later on. So, the subject matter is not the typical one of Shi scholar official poetry. I'm not sure the metric form is completely regular also, probably a bit irregular. I would have to see The original of this poem, there's probably a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not sure if, well, at least some of his poems don't really follow the rigid metrical requirements of Tang prosody. And the language. The language is probably the most unusual part. This is lost in the translation, but Hanshan's poems were written in the vernacular, as opposed to the classical Chinese language, which already at the Tang dynasty had become a sort of Latin, which required training and scholarship to master. And it wasn't a spoken language at the time. There was Middle Chinese, which had developed. But you wouldn't notice this, or you would hardly notice this from the poetry of the scholar officials. But you would in Hanshan, like his poetry is really infused with vernacular vocabulary. So all these elements would have contributed to his exclusion from the canon of classical Tang poetry in his own day, and even in later centuries, like both the subject matter, the language, they would definitely have marked him out. And this leads to a very curious effect. I mean, Hanshan, until recently at least, as far as I know, wasn't very popular, or at least didn't occupy a canonical position that was very high in Tang Dynasty poetry. Like if you asked Chinese people to rank the main 10 or 20 or even 30 Tang poets, Hanshan would probably not be among them. But this runs in stark contrast to what happened in the West. Hanshan, I think, along with the big figures with Li Bai and Du Fu, is one of the most translated poets, Chinese poets, in the West. Like there are at least 4 or 5 complete translations or partial translations that come to mind of Hanshan's poetry. And he was really, really popularized in the 50s, 60s among the beats in the United States. I think through the translations of Gary Snyder. I'm not completely sure. Whaley had already, I think, tried his hand at some of his poems before this, and perhaps others. I'm not completely sure about the Whaley part. I would have to check. Maybe in the Dunhuang, in his book on Dunhuang literature. But anyway, the thing is, this is unusual, that the canonical status of a writer of a foreign language is higher in the translated context than in the original context. That is to say, generally, when you translate poets from one literature to another, the canonical prestige and the focus on the translation follows more or less the pattern of the original canon, which we can see for most of classical Chinese poetry, like Du Fu and Li Bai are the most translated of Chinese poets, just as they are considered in the Chinese tradition as the best poets. But as we say, with Hanshan it's unusual. Like anybody in the West who knows a little bit about Tang poetry will probably know Hanshan and will probably have read, if not as many poems by Hanshan as by Li Bai or Du Fu, a big chunk. And if he is of the Beatnik-like persuasion and likings, he will have read more poems by Hanshan than by many other Chinese poets, perhaps even Li Bai or Du Fu. So this is unusual, this is interesting, this sometimes happens in translation, and I imagine this also creates a bit of a feedback loop, like this massive interest in the West on Hanshan probably has elevated his consideration in mainland China, I would suspect. Like, what do the Westerners like so much in Hanshan? Sometimes these imbalances between the popularity of a poet in the original language and in the translation stem from the ability of the translator. Like, he is able to take the concepts, the ideas, maybe even the language of the original, and forge a completely new work in language B, which stands on its own as a work in language B and connects with the philosophical, ethical, aesthetical inclinations of the moment. The typical example that is always raised is Fitzgerald's translation of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. That's a classic of Victorian English poetry, and it's well read. Omar Khayyam is not a poet that is really considered top-notch within the Persian literary tradition. He was mainly known as a mathematician and as a philosopher, and who wrote some quatrains, which, funnily, like the Hanshan poems are, it's not entirely sure that the inscription is actually correct and genuine. So like Fitzgerald creates a likable translation, a translation that reads very well in English and that connects very well with Victorian ideas of Orientalism and poetry and poetic quality. You could say the same thing happens with Hanshan, like Hanshan's preachy Buddhist poetry with rather crude and direct images, but still with this Oriental flavor that is, inevitable in Oriental translation, was probably really, really likable for the Beatniks. I mean, Chan Buddhism, under its Japanese sobriquet Zen, was very popular, with Kerouac and most of the Beatniks. So that probably influences the popularity and the reception in the West of Hanshan. So we will be seeing a few of these poems. I think at least 3 or 4 Hanshan poems, perhaps. And the main characteristic that makes them stand out, as I said, is the language, but the language is lost in translation. From the point of view of subject matter, there is a strong Buddhist and Chan Buddhist element, which appears a lot in his poems. There's a tension between ideas and reality, asceticism and secularization, a view of life as unchangeable decline, which is seen, is visible in this poem. The transience of existence, human sorrow. There are different solutions to the human predicament. Some of them are the typical carpe diem. Well, life is decline and misery. Enjoy the day. But there's also poems that follow the other way, like self-negation, retreat into the mountains, search of Chan, enlightenment through meditation. And also nature occupies a dual role. And there's probably a big influence of landscape poetry in Hanshan. But as we said, he is very, very peculiar. So let's go back to this poem that we read. So the topic of this poem is, you could say it's a very Buddhist topic, yeah? Which is, Buddhism considers eating meat as, well, traditionally Buddhism considered eating meat as a heinous sin. Like if you slaughtered animals and ate them for food, this would almost guarantee that you would be reborn in one of the hells, in one of the Buddhist hells, and be yourself turned into an animal and eaten by animals similar to those that you ate upon when you were alive. So this grim and macabre view of the beginning of the poem of pigs eating human remains and humans eating pig remains, it creates this image of the misery, the horror of existence where sentient beings prey upon each other and devour each other's flesh and kill each other in a sort of cannibalistic, dystopian image. And so the poem is pretty grim, and it follows these images of the horrors of existence, of devouring other creatures, and it doesn't hide away the gruesome, like guts and dead bodies and bad smell and throwing carcasses into rivers or burying human dead bodies into the land. But it ends on a relatively bright note. There's this metaphor, there's this image in the end of lotus flowers flowering in or surviving in a boiling soup, which it's an unusual metaphor. Like in the poem we read, it's like if humans are able, I would say there's a Buddhist interpretation, which is the one that Red Pine furthers in both in the translation he makes and in the notes he appends to this poem. And he says, like, the lotuses of blamelessness rise from the cauldrons of our past karma and provide an escape from hell's fires. So there is this cycle of accumulating bad karma, of eating each other, of devouring each other, of going to hell for this, dying. But there is hope, like we might rise from this, from the karma of existence, and through Buddhism, through illumination, through meditation, we might be able to arise from the cauldron, from the burning cauldron of hell and of our past karma, and blossom into illumination. Like the Buddhists usually use some symbols, like the moon or the lotus flower, as symbols of illumination, of transcending the realm of samsara. And so that's the topic of the poem. As I said, it's not very complicated in other respects, and it's like not full of quotations or references that we have to explain. So let's go straight to it. So the first two lines, so let's see the first couplet, really, the first four lines, because they form a block, if you wish. At least in another translation that I have here and that I'll read afterwards. Pigs devour dead human flesh. Humans savor dead pig guts. Pigs don't mind, humans stink. Humans say pork smells fine. So yeah, the poem begins, as I said, grimly. This is no exaggeration. Like poor pigs eating scraps and maybe even human remains, that probably happened in classical China quite a lot. Yeah, pigs are famously known for their omnivorous nature and for eating carcasses and dead meat and whatever you throw at them. And humans do like pig meat, all parts of it. Maybe guts are chosen here because of their unsavory look a priori. And so there's the cycle. The pigs are eating the humans are eating the pigs. It's a macabre feedback loop. And rotting meat or deteriorating meat or pigs, they don't smell pleasantly necessarily, but they taste good. So there's the idea the pigs are indifferent to the smell of carcasses, of the human stench, but the humans are also immune to pig stench. They like the meat, they like the flavor. So we are immersed in this cycle of cosmic cannibalism and of unpleasantness. Third couplet. Throw dead pigs in the river, bury human bodies deep. If they ever stop eating each other, lotuses will bloom in boiling soup. So the poem here seems to move to the imperative tone, and it's saying, we should stop doing this. Let's not continue eating each other. So dead pigs should be thrown in the river and not eaten. Human bodies should be buried in the soil. Let's put an end to this cannibalism. Also, these disposals seem to associate with the conventional images of death and disposal of bodies. But they fall in line with the last couplet, which, following these injunctions, tells you what might happen if we stop eating each other. If they ever stop eating each other, lotuses will bloom in boiling soup. So why would lotuses bloom in boiling soup? Lotuses would bloom on water, not boiling water. Perhaps the idea here is that the boiling soup, the cauldron where the soup is being boiled, is a little bit like hell, the hell to which we will go for eating other animals. But the lotus bloom can arise even in the narakas, even in hell. So, pretty interesting poem. I don't know if I would rate it higher than the best works of the scholar officials, but I can understand the appeal of this sort of poetry after you've read like 100 or 200 poems by scholar officials using the same trite feelings of sadness at autumn and sadness at parting and old age, and spiced up with obscure literary quotations from the canons. This is pretty fresh, pretty direct, and it conveys an interesting message that it's nice to think about. So this translation, as I said, is from the Collected Songs of Cold Mountain, translated by Red Pine, and that is poem number 72 in that collection. I'm also I will finish by reading another take. This one is by Edward Schaffer, and this is included in Sunflower Splendor, 3,000 Years of Chinese Poetry, page 90, the second of the Untitled poems by Hanshan. Swine gobble dead men's flesh. Men gobble dead pigs' guts. Swine do not disdain the smell of men. Men even talk about the scent of pork. But should a pork die, it is cast into the water. Should a man die, the soil is dug to hide him. Then neither finds the one or the other to his taste. Yet lotus flowers will live in boiling water.